Hi all. Welcome you all heartily to the very first episode of the Banyan Tree. This is a video cast, maybe a podcast if you're listening to the audio, in which we explore the insides of what goes into writing a book by our very known Indian authors and try to create a dialogue of a traditionally one directional conversation that we have had with some of the brightest minds yet. And inaugurating our very first episode of the Banyan Tree is Professor Rohit Prasad. Thank you so much, sir, for joining in and giving us your time and being sport for this conversation on your book. So here's a little something about Professor Rohit Prasad. He's a professor of economics at MDI Gurgaon, of course. Souradip and I have studied with him. He has a PhD in economic theory from SUNY Stony Brook, USA, where he studied game theory under the Nobel laureate Professor Robert Oman. His thesis, under the supervision of Professor Pradeep Dubey, leading professor at SUNY Stony Brook, provides a framework to address questions related to the optimal fiscal and monetary policy choices of a government in a free market. After his PhD, he worked in a software industry in USA and India in different positions before joining MDI Gurgaon. His last position was vice president at Zansa, then a USD 700 million firm. His research interests include the economics of ICT and sustainable development. His papers have been published at leading international journals, including Telecommunications Policy and Netnomics. He has delivered seminars and talks at Harvard University, the Center of Game Theory at Stony Brook, India Television 2009, and Futurecom 2010. His articles appear regularly in the Economic Times and the Economic and Political Weekly. I guess that beautifully sets the context for what we are going to talk about, the book Game Sutra, which Sauradeep will introduce here briefly, and then we'll move on to Q&A. Very
Sure. Thank you, Sahil. Hi, my name is Souradip Sarkar. Both Sahil and I had the privilege to study under Professor Rohit Prasad at MDI. Professor Rohit Prasad, if we may say so, is a author by now. He has written multiple books, including the book titled Blood Red River, and also the bestseller called Sutra, that many of you would remember from the cover of the well-acclaimed show TVF Pictures. So I have this book with me, and I was one of the few lucky folks to have this book actually signed and autographed by Professor Rohit Prasad. I'll read out the cover of this book. Game Sutra, Rescuing Game Theory from the Game Theorists. We'll come to that in a bit. This book has received multiple praises and testimonials. The most highlighted among them, of course, is by Professor Robert J. Oman, Nobel laureate, Economic Sciences 2005. This book is fairly interesting. It has got two nugget-sized chapters, and these chapters vary ranges. I mean, you would find a chapter on center of gravity, the Nash equilibrium. You would find a chapter on the Airtel Geo battle, and there's also a chapter called the fine art of making threats, Professor. So, and then there are many other called Rahul Gandhi and the Weird Dhokla game, and few others which will be coming in a bit. But before that, Professor, here's our first question to you. Not necessarily related directly to the book, but certainly would be very relevant over here. How would you explain game theory to a layman? And why did you choose to write a book on game theory?
First of all, thank you, Souradip and Sahil, for a very generous introduction. And congratulations on this new initiative. I'm sure that this will reach a lot of people and fulfill the aim for which it has been created. So congratulations once again. So you've asked me what is game theory and why I wrote a book on game theory. So let me start by asking you some questions. Don't be scared. This is not like the questions I used to ask in the lectures. But if we were to think about great game theorists or great game players, uh, of course, we would think in the world of sports for captains who were known to be very strategically savvy, like Nawab Patodi or Mike Brearley in cricket, uh, or Andre Agassi in tennis. But one would surely not restrict oneself to the sphere of sports. One would go beyond sports, right? So, if I was to ask you to tell me some people who you regard as great game players with a great game instinct, who comes to mind?
Well, certainly when it comes to football, we have Lionel Messi. Closer home, one of my favorites, Saurav Ganguly.
Right, right. So that's an interesting pair that you have chosen. Lionel Messi is known for his great skill, um, but is not necessarily the subject that game theory studies. Game theory actually abstracts away from the skill of the players involved. It assumes all of the players operate at a high level of skill. We call it rationality. Everyone is rational. What we talk about are the things which made Saurav Ganguly great. The ability to read a game, the ability to know when to attack, the ability to set high goals, the boldness, the ability to motivate his teammates, the ability to intimidate the opponent. All these are qualities that made Saurav Ganguly great, and these are the qualities that we study in game theory. So let's just begin with one of those qualities, the quality of understanding your opponent, right? So when Saurav Ganguly in the great series that he won against Australia in 2001, I think it was, in India, the series was held in India. Uh, there's a very interesting story that he would always make Steve Waugh wait for the toss. There is also a story of how he used Harbhajan Singh in that series. Harbhajan was playing, I think, his first series, and he picked up something like 22 wickets in three tests or something like that. So, what was that skill? What was that instinct that Saurav Ganguly brought in? He knew his opponent's pulse. He knew how to press the buttons of the opponent. In order to know that, you have to understand the opponent in a very deep way. Unless you do that, you can't do what Saurav Ganguly did, right? He knew that the Australians were playing away from home. They were playing in the subcontinent, traditionally known for spinning wickets, which Australians are not typically good at. He knew, therefore, they would be slightly on an edge, and he just increased that by making them, by small and big things, making them wait for a toss, by showing that he was as good as them, he was as belligerent as the Aussies, right? So that's the first instinct of a game player, the ability to think about what others are thinking, to think from their perspective. Even if you are in a situation where you want to win, and it's what we call a zero sum game, you can only win if you understand the other person from their perspective, not from your perspective. So that's the first great quality of a game player. Okay. And really, why is that quality important in games? It is important because games are interdependent situations where my payoff depends not just on what I do, but it also depends on what you do. And what you will do depends on what you want, which may be very different from what I want, right? So if I want to optimize my returns, I need to understand what you might be wanting to do and optimize with respect to that, right? But in order to understand what you might be wanting to do and what are the space of possibilities open to you, I need to understand you, right? So empathy is the first great quality of a game player. And we use the word empathy even though this quality may be actually used to destroy the other person. And let's look at the other great qualities of Saurav Ganguly: the ability to spot talent and to nurture talent. How many great players emerged under Saurav Ganguly's captaincy? What does it take for a leader to create a fighting unit that is cohesive and yet is comprised of fiercely competitive individuals who are proud of their place in the team and who protect that place with all the force at their command, right? So you see, this is in fact even a greater, this is an even greater quality than the first quality I mentioned, empathy, because this requires the captain to create an environment which comprises both competition and cooperation within the team. We are individuals and we are playing together as a team, right? So the captain has to tap both their competitive spirit with respect to each other, and yet you have to keep the team first, right? So how does a captain uh, understand what drives a person, what motivates a person, right? And how does the captain weave together this tapestry of different motivations, different skill sets, hmm, different personalities into a whole? That is what we call solving the problem of collective action. A team can very easily disintegrate into pure competition where everyone is just trying to protect their place in the team, show the other person down. And there have been cricket teams in India's past, which have been like that. So those are collective action failures. So the leader is one who can take the team from a situation, and usually all teams um, operate on one simple logic. And what's that logic? It's a logic that I'll do my best if the other person does their best. If other people are not doing their best, why should I do my best for the team? If others are sacrificing for the team, I'll sacrifice for the team. If others are not sacrificing, I won't sacrifice. Right? So, so this is what we call an assurance game in game theory, which it's called an assurance game because I will contribute only if I have the assurance that others will contribute. I will contribute blood only in the blood donation drive only if I will know that others will contribute. I will follow traffic rules only if I know others will follow traffic rules. I will not be corrupt only if others are not corrupt. I will vote only if others vote. Right? So in this game, which we call in the assurance game, there are two equilibria. One where nobody contributes because nobody else contributes, and another equilibrium where everyone contributes because everyone else contributes. So the job of a leader is to take the team from the bad equilibrium to the good equilibrium. By and how does the leader do that? By creating a nucleus, a critical mass of people who comply, people who contribute, people who cooperate. And that critical mass becomes the nucleus of a snowball effect, right? Which becomes inexorable almost. So I'll stop there. But game theory, to sum up, is really about looking at interactive situations. whether it is being part of a team, whether it is playing someone else in a zero-sum game, um, and seeing where this interactive situation will go based on the interplay of the self-interests of the different entities involved.
I mean, I guess the beauty of the answer was that it touched upon many aspects of what game theory is, and in fact, I was just writing down follow-up questions that are bouncing in my mind that I'm waiting to ask you. And before I actually follow up on the theory itself, one very intriguing question with pertaining to the book here is you have titled it Game Sutra, rescuing game theory from the game theorists. So what does rescuing game theory mean? How is it different than what it has been until now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So game theory, Sahil, it was born. It was a creation of mathematicians. Mathematicians are naturally inclined to think in terms of theorems, mathematical theorems, which are statements of truth, which are true with respect to the axioms upon which they rest, right? But once you accept those axioms, those statements are irrefutable and unambiguous. They are both irrefutable and unambiguous, right? Which means that you cannot doubt the truth of that statement, right? If you know, if you understand the tools of mathematics correctly. Secondly, two people looking at that same statement will come to an identical understanding of what it says. Okay. Now, life is not truth in certain spheres. In mathematics, truth actually can be expressed in this way and is expressed in this way, mathematical truth. But in life, in social sciences, in society, right, truth is not a mathematical theorem which is unambiguous and irrefutable. Truth is actually, in social sciences, it is something that is a product of a process of dialogue, of collectively coming to an understanding of something, right? And there is always the element of ambiguity that you may not understand the truth in the same way. That, for example, India is a secular socialist republic, right? But you don't understand the word secular in the way that I do. And I don't understand the word secular in the way that you do. And we will never understand the word secular in the same way as each other, no matter how long we talk about it. Right? It is impossible for us to arrive at that unambiguous and irrefutable shared understanding of any word or any concept. So therefore, what then is the role of a mathematical discipline in understanding social reality? Right? So what I said is that the role of a mathematical discipline is not to search for mathematical truths, because those truths don't exist. It is to provide one plank, one way of looking at this social reality, which must be combined with other ways like storytelling or statistics in order to build a story, in order to build a view of the world, and in order to persuade someone else of that view of the world. So I say that game theory is a tool in an act of persuasion, not a tool in the process of building a mathematical understanding of the world. which can never actually exist.
So we can I would safely call your game theory version 2.0, if that's fine by you.
Yeah,
And you know, when you go on describing about your understanding of game theory, I guess it validates a lot of questions that Sauradeep and I had while we were reading the book, because I'm immediately thinking of what you just said and trying to relate it to what I really wanted to ask. And this actually beautifully forays into the first question here, which pertains to purely the theory. Uh, that is, you mentioned while describing game theory that the leader has to understand what drives everyone, or what motivates everyone in the game, and then tap into that to deliver on a certain goal or to achieve a certain objective, right? And you also mentioned that not the individual skill of the player is looked at here, but you look at the higher level of skill that is called rationality, right?
yeah,
And rationality is very interesting, and I'll still say it, Sauradeep. I know you asked me not to, but it's a very controversial subject, uh,
sure.
right? So then, would you then define for us what rationality means? Is it different from the way traditional economics has looked at it? And does that definition of a rational person gives a room for accommodating different wishes or different ambitions that one person would have in the game?
Hmm, hmm. So, Sahil, let me ask you a question. Mm, You're doing this program, right? Why are you doing this? I mean, I'm very happy that you're doing this, but why are you doing this program?
So I would say there is more than one reason. I guess the first one was because when Sauradeep reached out to me, I thought that okay, he's actually a very good friend, and I would love to help him out, because his ask was that he wants someone to help him with this. The second was, of course, this is an opportunity to probably make something big. So yeah, if it turns out to be bigger, then great. If not, we still tried. And I guess third was to sort of realize that the reason I'm being asked for this is maybe because I'm good at asking questions. And I know that since I am, then might as well exploit this specific
Hmm,
skill. And
hmm. Right,
these became my motivations to go ahead with it.
right. So what I'm hearing is one was friendship, second was the possibility of being part of something big, and the third was that it matched your skill set, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
what I did not hear from you is that, you said, "Oh well, it's a slow day. I don't really know what to do, and I really, it's like totally boring. And what could I do? Maybe I'll toss a dice and decide whether I go for a movie or go for a smoke, or maybe I do this program that Shordeep is offering." Uh, you didn't do that, right?
Uh-huh.
You so you you are a person who weighed the alternatives, who thought about things and said, is it worth it, is it not worth it, right? And of course, when you were thinking about whether it's worth it, you were also thinking about non-material things like friendship, right? But you were certainly thinking about these things, right? Because human beings are goal directed individuals,
Yes.
are goal directed, right? We It's a different matter that we have a variety of goals, and our goals are often quite complicated and complex, and involve a mixture of different kinds of things. We want money, and we want love, and we want friendship, and we want security all at the same time, right? So it's complicated, but the fact is we are goal directed, right? And so, what the assumption of rationality means is basically taking this aspect of human behavior and bringing it into front and center of that subject. Saying, look, if you're going to try and study human behavior, the first thing you've got to build into that study is that human beings are goal directed individuals. And organizations also tend to be goal directed individuals. Countries also tend to be goal directed. Of course, building up what is the goal or the utility function, as we call it in economics, of a country is a complicated business. But one can believe that since a country is composed of individuals who are goal directed, at some stage it starts expressing the attributes of the individuals. Okay, so rationality means that the building the assumption of rationality right into the center of the subject means that we accept without any qualms the fact that humans are goal directed individuals. Okay, now this does not mean that game theory condones greed or selfishness. Okay, this is a very important point, because all we say is that human beings act in order to maximize their self-interest. That self-interest could be defined in very altruistic ways, like you did, saying it's about friendship, uh, you know, or it could be defined in very selfish ways, like a Wall Street stockbroker. It could be, or in some combination of the two. We don't we don't actually impose any conditions on that. You can define your value system in the way you like. Okay? But the fact is that you have a value system and you act according to that value system. And that's what the assumption of rationality means. People accuse game theory of actually promoting and condoning selfishness, because a study which makes self-interest a central part of its arsenal can very easily and very conveniently be interpreted as condoning selfishness. Okay, um, I could say that economics could be accused of this, because economics assumes that the world is consists of these utility maximizing individuals, right? um, and it also comes up with the results that these utility maximizing individuals actually result in efficient distribution of resources. The pursuit of profits and the pursuit of happiness actually leads to a very efficient society. That's what economics says. But game theory says very clearly, it doesn't just say this. Game theory also believes that the pursuit of self-interest is a force for good, no doubt. But game theory also strongly stresses that the pursuit of self-interest can lead to suboptimal outcomes for everyone concerned. That's what's the famous prisoner's dilemma, right? So game theory, I think, has been unfairly accused of of actually promoting selfishness in through its assumption of rationality. But I think a deeper study of game theory would make people realize that's not the case.
So you were saying that self-interest need not be just entirely selfish. Self-interest can be altruistic as well, and
Yeah.
it would change. So I guess this is what when last night Souradip and I were having a discussion, he made this statement, right, that every person is rational in his or her own right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what you're trying to put across here.
Hmm.
Um, that is interesting. That is really interesting. And I'll tell you why. Because the second assumption here, which you state, that everything is known, right? So the players, the strategies, and the payoffs are known, known to be known, known to be known, and infinity, right? In real life, however, um, from what at least I think intuitively, we not always know what the other person is doing. Uh, if top of the mind example I were to think of is in case of the US elections in 2016, a lot was happening on Facebook in the background in terms of targeted messaging going out to Americans that actually swayed them towards Trump and away from Clinton, right? Just one of the explanations, though. So when we are not really aware of all these strategies in real life, uh, how can we really rely on game theory? Is it really that countable? And second, uh, when we are talking about such a diverse mix of self interests, how do you really account for this in the theory itself, and how do you make sure that what you find out with the exercise can actually be counted upon?
Thank you. That's a very, very good question. Knowledge is actually one of the most important strategic variables. What do you know about the situation that you are in? What do you know about the other players? What do other players know about you? What do you convey to them about yourself? These are game changers, right? Now, when we say that game theory assumes that everything is known. Does it actually assume away the entire this entire challenge of actually of knowledge? Okay, does it assume it away? No, it doesn't, because what game theory says is that it's not necessary that you know everything about the other person, or that you know everything about the game, right? All that game theory assumes is that you have some beliefs about the other person. Okay, these beliefs game theorists express in the form of some probability distribution. Okay, because it's a mathematical discipline. So, but broadly speaking, all it assumes is that you're thinking about what kind of person is this guy. You know, is or the is she going to be, is he or she going to be more motivated by money, or will they be more motivated by status, right? Okay, I think they'll be more motivated by status. So you formed a belief, right? And then and that's the sign of a game player. If you hadn't formed beliefs, that would have been a very naive thing to do, because you would have ignored a very important strategic variable. So you form beliefs, you update beliefs as the game proceeds, and you play according to those beliefs. Sometimes it's not even possible for you to update those beliefs. Whatever you started with, that's what you're going to end with, and it will be too late later on to revise your beliefs. But as a game player, you have to know how to choose strategies based on beliefs. So, to answer your question, game theory does not assume that everything is known. Game theory assumes that everything that needs to be known is part of some probability distribution of beliefs. Okay, and it does make an additional assumption that this system of beliefs is shared across the players. Okay, that is a limiting assumption of game theory, but it's much less limiting than what you thought. But I do want to end this segment with one more example, and that's of office email. Okay, so game theory talks about a hierarchy of knowledge. There is something called common knowledge, which you refer to, which is that something is known, something is known to be known, something is known to be known to be known, and so on. But there's something called mutual knowledge, right? So suppose that there is a telephone call which goes out from the chief minister's office saying that there's going to be a curfew after 10 p.m. tonight. Okay. Now, everyone knows this because the call has gone from the chief minister's office, and let's assume the call is also received. But I don't know that you know it, because I don't know that if you've received the call or not. Okay, you don't know whether I know it. So this fact is known but not known to be known. So this is a lower hierarchy of knowledge, and it's called mutual knowledge, right? So in the case of an email, right, and each level of knowledge, leads to different implications about your gameplay, about how you internalize that knowledge and integrate it into your strategy. There are many famous puzzles about these kinds of different hierarchies of knowledge. But broadly, office email. So when suppose that you just find that your your somebody in your team, somebody who's reporting to you, is actually um, sort of snitching on you with your boss, right? So they're going to your boss behind your back, right? Now, suppose you want to confront your boss with it, right? Saying that this is not on. Why are you listening to this person without checking with me? So you could write an email to your boss, right? And when you write that email, you could mark a CC to your subordinate. If you do that, then it becomes common knowledge that this mail has gone, right? If you mark send a letter with a BCC, blind carbon copy to your subordinate, then the fact that this mail has gone is mutual knowledge because everyone knows the mail has gone. But people don't know that the others know the mail has gone, right? And in some situations, you choose to make it mutual knowledge. In some situations, you choose to make it common knowledge, right? So already what we are doing is we are using these different levels of hierarchies of knowledge in order to achieve our goals. So we already know this, right? It's not something new.
Yeah. Okay. So,
Uh,
I mean, I guess that answers my question very well, and that also gives rise to a lot of other questions. But I let Sauradeep ask. Sauradeep, I guess it's about time that you also put forth what you had in mind. Good time to take over your question on the premise that has just been set.
Certainly, Sahil, you raised it very, very rightly. And Professor, while you were speaking a while ago, you talked about self-interest. And this is where I'm going to pick up my next question from. And it's also going to be from your book, Chapter 4, Does Donald Trump Deserve the Nobel Peace Prize?
Hmm.
Now, this was also news a couple of weeks ago, precisely for the same reason, but perhaps the context was different than what you mentioned. You wrote this book back in 2019, early 2019, but perhaps we can say you were fairly right in predicting certain aspects of it. My question here is going to be: you talked about self-interest, and you said, the underlying belief that self-interest is a fundamental and unavoidable feature of human affairs, and you line suggests that both Kim and Trump are responsible for the peace pact that was made temporarily, though, between North Korea and US. And you suggest, therefore, that if Trump gets the Nobel Prize, Kim should too. You are using game theory to suggest something that perhaps most other people would not, go in line with. Take
Yeah,
on.
got it, got it. So you see, I think game theory, as we said, it regards the drive of human beings uh, to achieve their self-interest as a very fundamental aspect of human behavior, and therefore it regards any peace or any uh, cooperation that is based on uh, platitudes and noble intentions as somewhat flimsy. It believes that if this peace was based on some very uh, material, uh, concrete, mm, aspects of self-interest, it would be a more lasting peace. Now, coming to Donald Trump and Kim, okay, uh, if you remember, their peace meeting was preceded by a phase of saber rattling, where Kim was calling him, he was calling him a dotard, which means like an old senile guy, and Trump was calling him Rocket Man, and Kim was firing off missiles, every week, and it was a very very dangerous situation, right? And then the situation became so out of control, it seemed, that they had to come together and control it, right? And so it seems like this is according to what game theory predicts, or game theory recommends, that look, this is a piece which is based upon uh, self-interest, because both have gone so close to the edge of disaster that in their own self-preservation, they are now forced to come to the negotiating table. So all that happened before that, all the saber rattling, etc., was worth it because it helped to develop the conditions in which this lasting peace could be established. But if you note in that article, Souradip, I say that he doesn't deserve the Nobel Peace Prize for two reasons. One is a principle in decision theory which says just in an uncertain situation, just because some decision turns out right does not mean it was the right decision to start off with. Okay, and here I give the example of a ship lost at sea, where uh, the the captain has a choice of whether to draw anchor for the night or to try and make their way through the darkness. And the captain decides that they must try and make their way through the darkness, and they do so successfully. And in the morning, they discover that they narrowly missed hitting a huge iceberg. Right? So, what we call hindsight bias suggests that the captain made the right choice, but he didn't, because given all the uncertainties that were facing him, the sensible thing would have been to drop anchor, right? And the fact that his decision turned out right doesn't mean that it was the right decision. So Trump and Kim could very well have triggered an uncontrollable situation. So we cannot thank them, even though that uncontrollable situation did not come to pass and there was a peace summit instead. Okay, that's point one. Point number two is that actually in that article I've written another article in the book where I say that this peace between Trump and Kim cannot last because of what I call the paradox of asymmetric nuclear standoffs. If you remember, the previous nuclear standoff was between the US and the Soviet Union over the Cuba Missile Crisis, right? And there, the standoff, both the parties could come back from the brink through a set of face-saving maneuvers. Each party was giving concessions to the other, right? And I said that is possible only when there are two parties of roughly equal size. Okay, but when there's one huge party, a big guy, against a small guy, then the only concessions which the small guy can give, which would have any meaning to the big guy, are precisely those concessions which the small guy cannot afford to give. For example, take off the missiles that are facing South Korea, right? Now, he can't afford to do that because if he does that, or take out the missiles which are, which he plans to, launch on US cities, he can't do that because if the moment he does that, he's a dead duck. Kim Jong-un is dead duck if he does that. So he's not going to be able to make that concession ever. If he can't make that concession, this peace summit will go nowhere. Okay, whereas the Soviets and the US, they could make all kinds of concessions to each other without, which would have some meaning for the other party and still preserve their core interests. So the United States said, okay, I'll take out missiles from Turkey, right? They could do that because they had missiles in the UK targeted to Soviet cities, which would have done the job just as well.
That's very interesting. Now, further moving on, what many of our or many from our audience know is that you also served a high power committee on in the Department of Telecommunications, Government of India. You also worked in the two expert panel at TRI, where you studied the value of the two spectrum. You are a fairly expert on telecom, and you also wrote a chapter on what the IPL can learn from telecom, wherein you have suggested game theory to suggest some changes in the IPL auction format. I'll leave that for our audience to read because it's a very interesting chapter, and I perhaps not like to read it out at this moment. But again, moving on to another interesting chapter, it says Well, it's very close to many of our hearts. It says, are our kids really smarter than we are? So now in this chapter, interestingly, you touch upon multiple aspects. Slightly touch upon psychology, talk about the kinds of motivation within the student for pursuit of grades. But interestingly, you also talk about marks inflation. That's a hot topic. Almost all the alumni meets. And finally, you have used the subtle layer of game theory to suggest a change in the education system. Professor, if you could explain.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Indeed, a very interesting question. The answer to the question, are our kids really smarter than we are, is yes. Okay, so let's get that clear right off the bat. uh, but coming to the questions that you asked, um, the way that game theory approaches this is as follows. It says that suppose that the job of a teacher is to maximize the effort that the sum of the effort that the class puts forward. Okay, now what is the marking scheme which would do that? Okay, which is the marking scheme which would maximize the sum of the effort? Now, if you have a very tight marking scheme, right, then the good students in the class will get the top grades, but the ones slightly below them will not really believe that they can get the top grade, so they will not put in top effort, right? But if we were to actually give them some chance of actually achieving a top grade, if they stretch a little bit, then they will be incentivized to put in top effort, right? So by having a slightly relaxed grading system at the top, you actually incentivize those who are in the middle to put in extra effort. So that's how I explain the phenomenon of grade inflation. But then there's another aspect to it, that marks should not be inflated at the bottom, right? Marks should be inflated at the top to give people in the middle the incentive to work harder. But if marks are inflated at the bottom, then what it does is the people in the middle who don't expect to go to the top, let's assume there are just three categories: top, middle, and bottom, who don't expect to go to the top, they will, or the people at the bottom who don't expect to go to the middle, right? They will put in less effort because they know they can get passing grades even with lower amounts of effort. So grade inflation at the top end is a good thing, and that's probably why we see such high grades today. But if it is accompanied by grade inflation at the bottom end, then it probably is not serving the purpose of maximizing the effort that people put in. And that indeed is what's happening. I give data from the CBSE board where I show that the number of people passing is significantly higher today than it used to be.
So, since we are talking about maths here, Professor, um, and I guess a lot of people would pay heed to when you just said that today's generation is smarter than the previous ones, and a lot of people would disagree, quite angrily so. But so now again, going back to the very first answer that you gave about game theory, or how is it different, is that until now it has been looked at as a mathematical area of study where we are trying to create very irrefutable and unambiguous functions around how the world functions, creating a single version of truth, which is not the case. So when you are talking about game theory, you also mentioned that it is in some way a mathematical area of study because it involves probabilities, right? But so far the conversations or the examples that we have taken is a lot of thought-based work where we are trying to figure out what would one do or not do, or what would be the best approach for someone, given the again the basis of knowledge, the different hierarchy of knowledge that we are aware of. So then is game theory, version 2. an entirely theoretical and entirely textual exercise, or does it involve anything that can say that no, I'm saying this and this is why it is right thing and this is why it cannot be refuted?
Right. So thank you for that question. Game theory 2.0, as you call it, is a combination of methods. It involves storytelling. It involves data, marshalling of facts. It involves statistical analysis, hypothesis testing, and it involves building game models, of the kind that I have been describing,
Mhm.
and those game mathematically, okay, with some numbers uh, that we benchmark to real world numbers. So game theory 2.0 is an act of is an exercise in persuasion, which uses a mixture of methods. It uses literary flourish, it uses mathematical sophistication, it uses statistical sophistication, and the aim is to get across, to have a dialogue, and it is enriched by each of the elements of that dialogue, whether it is the game models, which are mathematical, whether it is the literary flourish in the storytelling, or whether it is the marshalling of the appropriate fact at the right time, um, or the demonstration of a statistical model or analysis. Each of these elements enriches that dialogue. So that's what game theory 2.0 is. It's part of this dialogue, multi-dimensional dialogue.
Okay, and a follow up to that would be: is there a framework, or sort of a set procedure that a game theorist would adopt to look at a problem and then solve it? Um,
Yeah. So each of the articles in the chapters in the book is a miniature uh, representation of uh, this game theory 2.0, as you so very kindly call it, this new approach to game theory. But I am also in the process of writing a book along with my co-author, Professor Sridhar, on spectrum. Sharadeep talked about telecommunications. And the broad thesis of this book is that uh, telecom companies are losing to internet companies. In other words, the Airtels of the world and the Geos of the world are losing to the Facebooks and the Googles of the world.
mhm.
Okay, and as a result of that, uh, there are two ways out. Either we accept the fact that sooner or later these telecommunications companies will be controlled by the internet companies, okay, as we are seeing happening in India, okay, or we change the rules of the game in order to create a level playing field between internet companies and telecommunications companies. These rules of the game relate to things like net neutrality, reserve prices of spectrum, taxes on telecommunications companies versus taxes on internet companies, and so on. Right? Now, this is the broad thesis of the book. Now, in order to actually establish this thesis, it we proceed in a series of steps. First, we describe the new technologies in today's markets, in today's world, where first of all, you have much greater possibilities with the use of unlicensed spectrum. You have the Internet of Things. You have new kinds of possibilities which make licensing of spectrum much less important. Okay, so we start with the technology part of it. Then we say, okay, if licensing of spectrum is much less important, and if the consumer is looking at an integrated package consisting of connectivity as well as devices riding on that connectivity as a kind of a bouquet, then what would be the relative profits of the telecom companies and the internet companies? In order to understand this, we build game models, okay, where we actually go through the mathematics to show under certain conditions, as the the uh, the element of the over the top products increases in the product mix that a customer consumes, it's going to reduce the profits of the connectivity provider, right? Or as the role of unlicensed spectrum increases, and as OTT or internet companies can use unlicensed spectrum to provide similar services, right? How the profits of the telecom company fall as the congestion coefficient of the unlicensed spectrum reduces. So we build these models, right? Then we say, fine, that's one part of the story. But there's another part of the story. Let's understand the dynamics between the internet companies and the telecom companies, not through game models, but through big debates that have been happening, like net neutrality, like this whole notion of walled gardens. Let's look at the debates which have been happening in the business press, and let's give it a little academic feel to it, but let's look at it verbally. So we do that. Once we've done, and then we also build in a statistical part where we look at spectrum prices and see, have they been falling over time as internet companies have become more powerful, as the profits of telecom companies have become lower. So does that result in a fall in spectrum prices or more unsold spectrum? So we do a statistical analysis, and then we do a sum up, right, where we argue the point or state the point that I asserted at the beginning, right? So to come back to your question, game theory 2.0 is exactly this mix that I just described.
So I know Sauradeep and Sir, we are exceeding the time limit here, but it's just that there is one really important question, and we didn't discuss this before, but I find it really relevant to this conversation. Is that when you're talking of all these problem statements in game theory, right? And here I will just take the liberty of quoting something that you said, as Lloyd Shapley was fond of saying, if you were to take all of society's resources and hand them to an insatiable dictator, leaving everyone else penniless, that would still be an efficient distribution. Game theory doesn't address any issue that does not deal with facts. That makes me wonder, and in fact, the examples that you give right now makes me wonder, what is the goal of game theory? Who is the benefactor of sorry, the beneficiary of game theory in the end? Why are we doing this at all?
The goal of game theory is, if I would say it in a slightly grandiose way, is the creation of an equitable, just, and peaceful society. However, game theorists uh, believe that we cannot achieve a just and equitable and peaceful society in a utopian vacuum where we assume that people will suddenly become good and altruistic, right? So game theory says, yes, my goal is the same as the goal of Mahatma Gandhi. It is the same as the goal of Mandela, of Martin Luther King, indeed of the Buddha. But I'm going to approach it in a very pragmatic way, beginning from where we are, who we are. We'll begin where we are and then work our way out of it. The risk of this discipline is that when we, in our attempts to emphasize the reality of human frailty and greed and all those kinds of things, I think we sometimes forget that human beings are also intrinsically, kind, and they are seekers of truth and beauty and companionship, right? So sometimes this becomes a story of nasty, brutish, bestial uh, beings, and perhaps this actually serves some psychological purpose to people who perpetuate this story. So we have to really be balanced about it. and understand that both sides exist.
That's true. Makes sense. Makes sense. Sauradeep, over to you.
Professor, my next question is life and game theory. What's the connection? And can one consciously use game theory to take critical or perhaps even trivial decisions given the number of unknown variables?
Yeah. So the answer is that game theory is a way of thinking about things, thinking about things in the world of business, in the world of sport, in the world of politics, and in your daily life. What are the elements of this way of thinking? That I understand that I'm in an interactive situation, and I've already described what an interactive situation is. So that interactive situation could exist with my kids, with my spouse, with my parents, with my friends, right? So we are in an interactive situation, and then it becomes very much part of your nature to understand what's going on, in a particular situation. Like one of the most common games that human beings play is the game of brinkmanship, where there are two people who are wanting something, right? And neither wants to step back from the brink, right? So it's a case of who's going to blink first, right? And human beings play this game all the time. It seems to be one of our favorite pastimes. So you know that this is the game that's being played, and we know that in a game of brinkmanship there are two or three ways it can end. One is mutual destruction, the other is a mutually face-saving compromise, or a clean sweep for one party, right? So we know that there are only three ways, and we know that whatever the parties are doing in the process of arriving at that conclusion is basically trying to negotiate, to maneuver to the outcome that's most favorable to them, and they're doing that by sending various signals, by taking various stances, by saying various things, by doing things, various things. So we see that, we begin to see all these things as they happen. But one thing which I must mention before I end is that in life, in all aspects of life, human beings tend to look at situations as zero sum situations, which is, I win and you lose, or you win and I lose, right? And this may be a genetic hangover from our hunting gathering days, when human beings used to be moving around in nuclear families, and the world was very competitive and brutish. But most situations in life are actually non-zero sum games, where there are elements of competition and cooperation, what we call co-opetition in every situation, right? And human beings really, and game theorists, if there's one thing that game theory teaches you, it is that stop thinking about the world as a zero sum game. Okay, it's a non-zero sum game, and the techniques, the strategies that work in zero sum situations, what we call the max min approach, those strategies don't work in non-zero sum situations. So to answer your question, Shoradip, I certainly believe that game theory, the game theoretic way of looking at the world, is applicable to everything that you do. But I will also end with a caveat. There is no foolproof science to decision making. There is no magic bullet that anyone can give you, right? Decision making will ultimately always be partly about making that hunch, that gut feel, so game theory is not going to solve that part of the challenge.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And I guess Sahil has a very interesting question to ask. Sahil, over to you.
We'll close it with this, Professor. And I know this is on a lighter note. Did you use game theory to determine the price of your book?
My book, well, you know, it's about signaling. It's about signaling brand. You know,
Yeah.
so if you price something high, then people assume it's got good quality. And since I knew the contents of the book, I knew I needed every single trick I had in order to sell it. So I had to price high.
Okay. Okay, that's amazing. That's amazing. And you are a professor. You are probably more exposed to knowledge than anyone else, right? Any other profession, really. So, any resources, any books that you recommend that changed the way you think, or that had a significant impact on your life, you would always perhaps would want to read.
For me, a book impacts me when I cannot leave that book. For example, there's a book called The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham. It's about this guy who is an airline pilot in World War II, and then after coming back from the war, he kind of, gets alienated from his old ways of living, and he goes off to Paris and he becomes a taxi driver ultimately, and it talks about his quest for meaning, really. And I read it when I was in college, and I couldn't stop reading it when I started reading it. So that book impacted me a lot. So I've been impacted a lot by books in literature and books in philosophy. I'm an admirer of people who write uh, books which have central ideas which can be expressed in single words or two words, and build a whole book around it. So I'm not able to think of one right off the bat, but perhaps you could help me. Uh, for example, I think Taleb has this book called Anti-Fragility, or he
Yeah,
has the Black Swan. So when I admire that quality, that ability of someone to spin a huge story around a simple concept. When I read the book, I find a lot of it is BS, I must admit. But nevertheless, I do admire that quality. I do admire that quality.
okay, okay. I mean, I guess that was a wonderful conversation, Professor. And again, thank you so much, so much for joining in and taking out the time, which we exceeded, and you accepted quite graciously, to entertain all the questions that we have had. There are a lot more from where it came, but that, of course, would be offline, maybe over email or on a private call later
Sure,
someday.
sure,
And
sure.
again, thank you
Thank,
so.
Yes.
thank you so much. Thank you so much. I actually enjoyed this a lot, and I think this has got a great future.
Sure. Thank you.
And
Thank
and
you.
be- be- and before we end, we would be providing the link to this book in our description. So if you haven't read this book yet, please do go ahead and buy it and read it. It's certainly going to be a very interesting pick
That sounds
and a
good.
collection. Right. So so with that, on a high note, we end our conversation over here. Do comment in if you want to, if you have any preferences for any other authors. With that, comes to an end of our interview. Thank you so much.